There have been 3 major national elections since the Citizens United decision in January 2010. The first one was in the fall of 2010, that very year. In all 3 of those, by the way, the side that spent the most money lost. Believe it or not. In 2010, the Democrats outspent the Republicans by a sizable margin across the country, but were soundly defeated across the United States. Republicans took control in 2010 of the U.S. House and added 6 U.S. senators. Republicans also flipped 18 state legislatures to Republican control. And remember, they were outspent by Democrats. 2 years later, Republicans outspent Democrats. Romney's forces, the forces supporting Mitt Romney, vastly outspent the forces supporting Obama, and they lost. Obama held the White House. Democrats carved back on Republican control of the House and added to their control of the Senate. 2014, that was the last major national election. The situation was reversed yet again. Republicans were vastly outspent by Democrats. The biggest individual donors were Democrats. All of you have heard of the Koch brothers being big spenders. Of course they are. Not this year, by the way. They're sort of bowing out this year. But anyway, it's not even close. The largest donors are Democrats in the last few years. Tom Steyer has the all-time record, who only donates to Democrats, and only for one issue, the climate change issue. Holds the all-time record in an individual year for campaign spending. The 2 largest super PACs were Democratic. They spent twice what the Republicans spent. Yet, 2014, as we all know, was a wave election for Republicans. Republicans took over the Senate and added governors and state legislators. So in all 3 national elections since Citizens United, the side that spent the most money lost. This year, Democrats are outspending Republicans. If you follow this track record, it's going to be a big Republican year, if you look at things that way. Eric Cantor, this is my favorite anecdote of all. 2014 Virginia Republican primary for Congress. He was one of the most powerful members of Congress, one of the highest ranking Republicans. People were grooming him to be, president, vice president, secretary of state at the national level or something like that. Secretary of something or another. He outspent his opponent 50-1 and lost. Now, to me, this would be embarrassing. If you're arguing that the Constitution needs to be amended to stop the evil corruption of money in politics, this would be embarrassing. But they just keep going on. People have been studying, I should say, psychologists, political scientists, sociologists, social scientists of all kinds, economists, have been studying public opinion and what forges public opinion for 50 years. There are hundreds of studies. Let me just say that the way that people decide to vote is a product of many, many factors. Our gender has more to do with the number of ads we see on TV. Our age has more to do. Our race, our religion, our religious affiliation, our occupation, our industry that we work in, all have much more to do with the way we vote than the number of ads we see on TV. In fact, the prognosticators who get paid to predict election outcomes, they don't even use money as one of a major part of their formulas to predict election outcomes. I mean, it literally cannot, it is not the driver of election outcomes that the proponents say. Of course, there's nothing new about wealthy having more influence than poor. Nothing new about that. Ever since the printing press was invented, the people who had the printing presses you could say had more, quote, influence than the people who didn't have printing presses. Here's a quote from 1830. Quote, "It is well known that printing is a power that governs the destinies of mankind, and therefore those who can control the printing press can control their fellow creatures. At this time, 1830, the means of printing are so expensive that the great mass of people are almost totally deprived of their use, while the wealthy few wield this mighty engine to increase their own power and to weaken that of others." That was 1830. Folks, there never was a time when everyone had, quote, equal influence. As long as you can look back, whenever after the printing press was invented, whoever had the printing press, usually the wealthy, let's admit it, had more influence than those who didn't. And there's nothing new. There's nothing new about rich people funding poor people in politics. It's been happening for centuries. All of us are familiar with the great leaders of the abolitionist movement who sought to overturn slavery in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, James Brown. No, James, was it James Brown? James?
John Brown?
John Brown. John Brown. Harriet Tubman. All the great abolitionists that we all know were very poor people, mostly. They were quite poor. In fact, Frederick Douglass was a former slave. They were funded by rich people, including people like Garrett Smith, one of the wealthiest people in the world, who was related to the John Jacob Astor fur trading empire in the state of New York. He spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars to abolish slavery. He literally unleashed millions of separate pieces of mailings that were sent to the American voters to try to end slavery. By the way, he bailed Frederick Douglass out of jail. The abolitionists that we all know were also supported by a couple of brothers known as the Tappan brothers. This is Lewis Tappan. He had another brother named Andrew Tappan. Very, very wealthy. They founded the company that is now anyway, have to go back on Wikipedia for that. Anyway, they were in the Massachusetts area. Very, very wealthy. Probably wealthier than on a per capita scale than the Koch brothers are today. Vastly wealthy. The equivalent of billionaires at that time. And they spent massively to support the abolitionist cause. There's nothing new about rich people supporting pamphleteers of all kinds going into the past. That's, of course, Thomas Paine, the man who wrote Common Sense, still per capita one of the best-selling political flyers or pamphlets or books ever published. He was a poor man, and he was supported by rich people, including Gouverneur Morris and Robert Morris. By the way, Benjamin Franklin also supported Thomas Paine. Karl Marx, whatever you think about him, he was a poor man. And he was supported and funded by a rich man named Frederick Ingalls, a friend of his, who owned a furniture factory. Abraham Lincoln, at least in his early years, was a poor man. He was supported by rich men, including the Central Illinois Railroad, a for-profit corporation, and the largest shareholders of that supported his political campaigns throughout his career. There's nothing new about dark money in politics. Dark money being people who fund political ideas in secret and sometimes under alias names and pseudonyms. It's been happening for centuries. George Washington used alias names. He called himself Fabius sometimes. James Madison would call himself, he used several. I have to think of them. Of course, he obviously was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers along with John Jay and Hamilton, and they used Publius. John Adams used Humphrey Plowjogger and a couple other aliases and pseudonyms. They all used pseudonyms when they wrote about politics. Why? Because of fear. The political system that they were fighting against was very powerful, and it wanted to know every face who defied it. Benjamin Franklin, of course, was a printer by trade. He used hundreds of pseudonyms in his career. Alexander Hamilton used Publius, among many others. This is Benjamin Rush, another founding father, signer of the Declaration of Independence. He used the pseudonym Leonidas or Leonidas, and amazingly, he actually was investigated by the Continental Congress itself. Remember, that was the Patriots. The Continental Congress were so outraged by a letter to the editor written by Leonidas that they demanded to investigate who that was and to haul him in for a criminal investigation. And that triggered an earlier discussion in the Continental Congress about the freedom of speech and press. There's nothing new about this. Now, let's talk about the so-called bipartisanship of the people who promote campaign finance reform. Of course, we're all familiar with Bernie Sanders and the others. They tell us that it's nothing but a good government movement, right? It's not partisan, it's not left, it's not right, they tell us. It's just about maintaining the integrity of the election, as they would tell us. That's Professor Leonard Lessig in the middle, Harvard law professor who's written several books, and he goes on speaking tours. That's Professor Martin Guylands at Princeton, same thing there. That's Bill Moyers, PBS host, has a show. They've spent hundreds of hours talking and promoting campaign finance reform as if it's a reform that would just make democracy work cleaner, right? That's what they sell us. The thing is, I've seen enough videos of these people. After speeches, they sometimes get questions and answers where they admit when they're talking to a crowd that they think is their own, they admit they couldn't care less about this topic. The fact is, Professor Lessig actually cheered on Tom Steyer. I told you he's the Democratic funder who has the all-time record. Lawrence Lessig has no problem with big billionaires who fund Democratic politics. No problem whatsoever. He has an organization called Root Strikers, aiming at striking at the root. He says that he failed to get what he wanted out of politics. In other words, his climate change agenda and single-payer health care and this socialist agenda, the same kind of thing that Bernie Sanders promotes. These guys know that they cannot get what they want as long as there's free elections and freedom of speech. They know they can't get there. The polls do not support their agenda. And so what they're trying to do is stop the private sector from criticizing government. Climate change is an example. It is the quintessential issue of wealthy, powerful elites. I'm talking about the agenda, the climate change socialist agenda to give government more power to cap and trade and carbon taxes. Polling after polling shows that the majority of Americans have not bought it. It is the quintessential issue of wealthy, powerful elites. The voters haven't bought it. 1/3 of all voters say that the climate change hysteria may be an utter hoax, a total hoax. Those are the words of Gallup. 1/3 say that the whole climate change, the apocalyptic hysteria that's being promoted by the government, may be a total hoax. These people know they can't get what they want unless they stop the private sector, especially the business community, from criticizing government programs and regulations. What they want is a more socialistic America. And it's funny, they talk about corruption in government so much, but you really peel back the layers of the onion at what makes these people work, and you realize they have an almost childlike trust in government. They believe in government. If only they could stop the private sector from criticizing their wonderful ideas and programs of government, then government could accomplish everything that they think it needs to accomplish. They frequently spread this notion that those evil Koch brothers and the Adelson and the big free market billionaires are moving America into a deregulation or a more free market oriented economic society. Nothing could be further from the truth. Again, every single claim is false. This is a study by the Mercatus Center about regulation at the federal level. What's funny is regulation is very easy to measure, very easy to measure. You can count pages, you can count statutes, you can count budgets, you can count enforcement actions. Any measure you can think of to measure regulation shows. Regulation has been growing in our lives. It has not been decreasing. There has been no deregulation. This is the big one right here. To me, this data is pretty much everything that you really need to know. If you look at the world, as I do, as a battle between the government and the private sector, there's no question who's winning. It isn't even questionable. The government has been defeating the private sector for a century. That red is federal spending. The blue is state level spending. The total of GDP, the entire output of the country, government has been slowly eating up the market share of the private sector for a century. There's no question who's winning. There has been no movement to cut government, as Bernie Sanders would tell you. I don't want to get deep into this, but spending on social programs has gone up and up and up. This is education. You see the lines of spending. The lines that are going flat are outcomes. So we're spending so much more as taxpayers on all government programs, health care, you name it, education. Outcomes absolutely flat. One of the biggest myths of these campaign finance reformers is the idea that those evil rich have managed to move the tax structure in their favor. Again, every single claim is false. You see that the top fifth, the top quintile, or top 20% of income earners are paying 83, almost 84% of the entire tax burden of this country. So the top 20% are paying 83.9% of the total income tax in this country. Here's the same data in a graphic form. The blue is the top 1% and the share of taxes that they've been paying in the last few years. It's been going up and up and up. The yellow are the people like me, the people in the bottom 50%. Believe it or not, our tax burden in relation has been going down. The top 1% are paying more and more and more. Did you hear Bernie Sanders talk about that when he was going around? Here's the same data with more layers. You can see the top 1% at the top in the dark blue there. The 1% are paying a higher burden of taxes than they ever have. Those of us at the bottom, we're actually paying less taxes. In fact, the people under 45% actually pay no taxes in this country. So it is in their interest to seek more and more crumbs from government. The neutrality of government as speaker is one of the biggest myths. Government is constantly spending billions to influence us politically, constantly. Every year, you look at the war on drugs. They've spent at least $1 billion, hundreds of millions annually, telling us the evils of drugs in the private sector, promoting the government's agenda. And by the way, these are things that I disagree with, that are contested. Many Americans disagree. This is campaign spending, folks. And yet they don't have to disclose quarterly reports to the Committee of Political Practices, do they? The military spends billions promoting itself. Billions. This was one of the ad campaigns they had about 10 years ago. U.S. Navy, a global force for good. Reuters did a poll at that time. Turned out over 80% of Americans disagreed with that campaign, that ad campaign. They believe the Navy is supposed to defend the country, not supposed to be a global force. Again, this stuff is contested. These are political ads, and yet government gets to put them out on a massive scale and never has to comply with all these campaign finance regs. By the way, if you were a wealthy person and you wanted to spend $100,000 criticizing these campaigns, you'd be called corrupt by Bernie Sanders. He would call you corrupt if you spent money to defy these. It has come out that the military has spent millions of dollars on patriotic support for the troops, support the U.S. military shows at NFL games, Major League Baseball games, NBA games, even college football. Millions of dollars secretly, this is true dark money, in secret, has gone so that people would have these displays of honoring the military at these NFL games and, you know, thank the troops. And millions of dollars secretly was taken from our paychecks by force to pay for these moments of silence and moments of honoring the U.S. military. That campaign spending by another name. By the way, there have been scandal after scandal about government agencies actually buying reporters actually buying reporters. It's been happening for years. One scandal after another. A committee of Congress will look into it 1 year. Next year it happens again. This is an entire book about how the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover would buy the major reporters at the major newspapers and TV networks. Actually buy them, literally pay them money to have pro-government reporting. The CIA has also been caught many times funding reporters. At least one retired CIA asset has come forward saying that a reporter is cheaper than a hooker and more loyal than a hooker. More and more voters. This is what the polling really shows, by the way. Remember, these campaign finance reformers will tell you that those evil rich people that are supposedly controlling and bribing and winning and buying the elections, that they've moved America in a more free direction, more free market, against the will of the voters. Nothing could be further from the truth. When polling actually asks questions about the voters' feelings about government in the big picture, not just a bill that happens to be before Congress or something, the voters actually are much closer to the Libertarian Party when they assess government critically. More and more voters view the government as an immediate threat, quote unquote. Those are the words of Gallup, and want less government. Socialism. Only 36% of the voters actually support socialism. 69%, that's a super majority, support free markets. 55%, by the way, I view free markets and capitalism as the same thing, but I've been told not to use the word capitalism because some people don't like the word and they'd rather use free markets. I don't know. I like the word capitalism. I really do. The voters are for it. They're with me. 66%, that's a super majority, do not support a government-managed economy. A vast supermajority oppose raising taxes. The voters are actually closer to those dastardly Koch brothers that we've all heard about, those funders of the Cato Institute and with their sort of libertarian think tanks and things. The voters are closer, more aligned to the Koch brothers than they are to Professor Leonard Lessig and these, Professor Martin Gilings and these promoters of campaign finance reform. Vast supermajority opposes higher taxes. Climate change, again, the quintessential issue. It is not supported by the majority of voters. The quintessential issue of wealthy, powerful elites who are mad that they can't get the majorities that they want. They are working day and night to try to get around the democratic process. They cannot get what they want as long as there is freedom of speech and free elections. Gallup has been asking this very interesting question for about 10 or 20 years. How many cents out of every dollar does the federal government waste? It's now above 50 cents out of every dollar. The average American now says that the federal government wastes 51 cents out of every dollar. So this campaign finance reform movement that wants to promote trust in government and getting the private sector from funding all these ads, criticizing government, the average voter does not agree with them. They say 51 cents out of every dollar the federal government spends is wasted. In my opinion, it's much, much higher than that. Majority of voters say government is too powerful and doing too much. They want less government. Finally, there are First Amendment implications. This is the scariest part of this. In my opinion, the campaign finance reform movement is a greater danger to freedom of speech and freedom of press. And by the way, the other First Amendment freedom, freedom of religion, freedom to petition government for redress of grievances, freedom of assembly, etc. A greater threat than any other danger ever in American history. Greater than the Alien and Sedition Acts of the 1790s. Greater than the McCarthy period, which was a threat to the First Amendment. Greater than any of the Red Scares, which was a danger to the First Amendment. The campaign finance reform movement threatens the very core of the right of the American people to criticize the state and to criticize politicians freely without reporting quarterly or whatever, reporting to government or identifying themselves to government. Anybody know who this gentleman is? in the lower corner.
Graduate.
That is Greg Gianforte. Greg Gianforte. And I threw that picture in there because it's very interesting. Right before he announced he was going to run for governor this year, he did a very interesting thing. He donated $8 million to MSU to have a building with his name on it. Did you guys know that? He donated $8 million. Now keep in mind, that's not a campaign donation. That wouldn't go into his official campaign disclosures. See, he's a wealthy man, obviously. But just think of all the tricks that people can use to gimmick the system, I guess. And that's why, you know, this agenda of clamping down on the spending, well, it doesn't catch a lot of stuff that actually does influence. And I don't even know if that influenced anybody. But he got his name on the front page of every paper in the state. He had pictures of himself shaking hands with the MSU president. Spent $8 million, and then he coincidentally announces that he's running for governor the same year. Very interesting. I just throw that in because there's so many ways to influence, and we don't catch them. These policies and campaign finance regs don't catch everything. There's no way that you can put it all in a box. Eric Cantor, that man who was defeated, even though he outspent his opponent in the Republican Virginia primary for Congress, Republican. He lost even though he outspent his opponent 50-1. What's interesting, in the wake of that, there were several essays that went around in major newspapers and on the internet blogs saying, well, there was more to it than that. There was dark money behind his opponent, David Bratt. Dark money. His job was dark money. He was a professor of economics who was, he had an endowed chair or some kind that was paid for by some Ayn Rand think tank or something. Oh, his job was dark money. They said that Laura Ingraham, that woman, the talk show host, conservative talk show host, or Laura Ingraham, spent hours promoting David Bratt to defeat Eric Cantor. And well, you got to look at who was funding her commercials, supporting her show. Just think of the danger to the First Amendment. Ultimately, they would give power to government to go fishing on fishing expeditions, surfing through people's lives. What is your job? Well, who's paying for the commercials for the Rush Limbaugh show that seems to be promoting you? Who's paying for commercials for Rachel Maddow that seems to be promoting you? I mean, this is where they want to take government, unleashing vast powers to investigate even newspapers, radio shows, any content. President Obama's book. I mean, most people wouldn't call that as a campaign spending, but really, politicians do things like that all the time. And if you unleash the power of the state to investigate it, well, what would stop them from banning books? What would stop them from going in and saying, well, isn't that interesting? You came out with a book right before you announced your candidacy. Very interesting. Fines, imprisonment. I mean, this is where they want to take this country. Finally, up on the top there, this is very typical. All of our newspapers every election year will endorse. They will issue these full-page endorsements. The value of that to a candidate is immense. And here's an example. This guy, Ben Kalos, running for New York City Council, he points to the New York Times endorsement saying, hey, New York Times endorsed me. The value of that. Most people would not think that the Bureau of Political Practices can go after the New York Times, but this is where it's going to go, because ultimately, what stops people from saying that even the New York Times, a for-profit corporation, shouldn't be banned from ever endorsing candidates, which of course is an age-old tradition. Finally, dark money. And this is something that is a hard sell. I'm the only guy who seems to be viewing the world in the way that I view it. Almost everyone, any reporter can go up to anyone and say, do you think you have a right to know who's funding politics or political ads? Everyone in the world will say, absolutely, I have a right to know. And there's the idea of transparency. All spending needs to be known. Of course, if it needs to be known by you, that really means that it must be known by the state. It really is a power of government to know all who criticize government. Every government that ever existed wanted to be able to demand that all who criticize the state must show themselves. And this is the rule right now that is in place in the state of Montana and nationally. By the way, the Citizens United decision, which was supposedly so rotten, 8 of those judges agreed that the government has the right to know all who fund politics, which to me is very dangerous. There was one dissenter. Actually, he wrote a concurrence. He supported the majority along with, Alito and Scalia. Clarence Thomas wrote a concurrence in the Citizens United decision in which he disagreed with them. That's my man, Clarence Thomas. He disagreed with them on that one issue. All 8 agreed that the government had the right to know, and that all had to be naked before the state. Clarence Thomas said, wait a minute, I disagree that people need to identify themselves and subject themselves to violence and government reprisals and persecution just because they fund a political ad campaign somewhere. And I want to close with a little passage from a book, actually. Anybody know who Amy Goodman is?
Yeah.
Amy Goodman.
Democracy Now!
Democracy Now! She's a journalist, and I respect her. She's a good journalist. She, you'd have to say she's a far progressive. She's on the progressive end of politics. And by the way, the content on her radio show, on her TV show, Democracy Now!, promotes the campaign finance agenda all the time. And yet, in her own book, this is called Standing Up to the Madness, she begins the book with this terrifying passage, and I just want to read it because it illustrates a lot about this illusion of dark money. In 1942, a group of students and their professor at the University of Munich in Germany responded to the tyranny and oppression of the Nazi regime by secretly publishing and distributing a series of 6 leaflets. This nonviolent resistance group called itself the White Rose. By the way, they talk about the White Rose throughout this book. Its leaders included Hans and Sophie Scholl, a brother and sister who were devout Christians, and philosophy professor Kurt Huber. The students typed the leaflets, ran off copies, and secretly sent them by courier to cities around Nazi Germany to be left in public places. They wanted to ensure that Germans could never say that they didn't know what was happening in their name. And they hoped to inspire their fellow citizens to rise up and actively oppose the Nazi regime. Hans and Sophie Scholl and Kurt Huber were caught by the Gestapo while distributing their 6th leaflet. They were tried for political crimes in the so-called People's Court and beheaded. Today, numerous buildings and streets in Germany are named for the Scholls and Huber. That is an example of, to me, I guess you could say, the quintessential reason why so-called dark money, I think that's a terrible way to phrase it, but the right of people to secretly meet with each other. By the way, the founding fathers of America, they met in secret all the time in taverns and places. And they used alias names. They had to. The right of freedom of speech and press has to include, and again, no one agrees with me. Everyone disagrees with me. Even people who otherwise agree with me on some of this stuff disagree with me on this point. But in my opinion, the First Amendment includes a right of people to defy a tyranny that might arise among them and secretly pay for pamphlets or leaflets or brochures like this White Rose Society did in Nazi Germany. It is a right that we have, and it's almost no one defends this. And again, it is not the law. I'm in the minority. I've lost in the political system. Everyone disagrees with me. Right now, all who fund politics must show their faces to government. Government must know today, wants to know who dares criticize politicians. But to me, this is one of the most vital parts of freedom of speech and press. And again, I just want to say that every single claim of the campaign finance reform movement is false. Not a single claim, not even one, is true. And with that, I thank you. And I would take any questions. Go ahead.
First, thanks for coming and fostering thought about political things and putting your ideas out here. And my question is, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how corporations and individuals campaigning were spending money, but it didn't have a lot of effect on the outcomes.
Okay.
And I was wondering why you think they spend so much money.
Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson and Walmart and Anheuser-Busch don't spend millions of dollars a year for nothing. Obviously, they get a benefit from that. Who could deny that? I don't. But politics is a little bit of a different product in my mind. And the spending is much, much, much less related to the outcomes than it is for selling a product on the market or a service on the market. Most of us, by the way, are not going to change our vote no matter how many hundreds of campaign ads we see on TV. We're not going to. I mean, we all believe that we ourselves are wise voters. It's those dummies, other people, they need to be protected from all the spending, right? I'm convinced that, in fact, by the way, I've seen quotes from people who are paid professional campaign managers who are paid by these big campaigns, Jeb Bush campaign, Hillary Clinton, et cetera. Sometimes they are quoted in the newspaper saying, you know, the campaign spending might get us 1 or 2% different. I mean, that's all it is. There's a chance that it's 1 or 2%. And by the way, no political scientist or set of political scientists have ever been able to show a formula where they can type in dollar amounts and predict outcomes. Some of you might have heard of Nate Silver, predictors of politics. He predicted that Obama would win over Romney, for example, when everybody else, the polls were showing Romney was going to win. He doesn't even use the campaign treasuries as part of his formula for thinking about that. The money, who could deny money can have an influence? I think it probably does have an influence at the lowest level, and like the dog catcher kind of races. Most of us voters, even me, a libertarian voter, will respond to the local candidate for dog catcher who seems to want the job the most. I mean, I'm talking about the political races that are most like a job application, where let's just say the county bridge inspector or something. Let's say there are 2 candidates and you're a voter and you get a postcard from one in the mail and you get no postcard from the other one. Well, honestly, some of us do tend to reward the local candidate in the races that are most like a job application, that are most like a job, at the lowest level. But as you go up through in the political process and you find these races that are more of a policy-making agenda over your life, you are much, much less likely, I think, to be swayed by spending.
Just to poll the audience, has anyone ever changed their vote because of some commercial or political speech that you saw that you thought, oh, hey, I was actually wrong, I'm changing my vote?
I don't think it's ever changed my vote. I think what it's done is it's made me more informed to topics that are on discussion, which makes me look at what the topics are, how the political campaign is working towards or against, and then I have to evaluate how I feel about that. Is that for me or against me?
Any other questions?
I have one. As far as transparency goes, when people want to have transparency with campaign spending, is it more to identify with crony capitalism, which is not really, it's more fascism, anything more than anything else, but to see what major corporations are out there funding what candidate, to see the backlash of it? Is it more to just kind of, to maybe pretend that that's what it's for?
Well, certainly there's an aspect of that. You know, most of the major corporations they actually fear being identified as political. And they are punished in the market when they are openly viewed as political. There might be a few exceptions. I'm thinking of Hobby Lobby sometimes is viewed as political, it's conservative, I think of some other examples. Well, Koch Industries, but then they're not traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Most of the big companies fear being identified as political. Why would any big business risk losing half its potential customers? You know, I mean, these beer companies, I mean, car companies, the biggest fear they have is to be identified as, you know, pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. You know, maybe the oil industry is a little different. You know, it almost seems like the entire industry is more Republican supported, less Democrat. I don't know. But it seems to me most big businesses do not want to appear political. And there, by the way, in my opinion, there's no danger at all of, you know, frequently you'll see newspaper reporters say that the Citizens United decision released unlimited, allowed corporations to spend unlimited amounts on politics. That is a lie. There are so many barriers to them, even legally. And by the way, realistically, there are other barriers. But, you know, there's such thing as a shareholder derivative lawsuit. If you own even one share in a corporation, you have a right to sue that corporation if it wastes your money. You know, frequently, you know, there's a rule of corporate governance that says they must seek profits above all other factors. And frequently that is attacked. People don't like that. But it's a good rule, and it's there to protect poor people. Poor people who invest their life's fortune in a stock, expecting that that's an investment that will grow for them. Let's just give you an example of a guy who puts his life savings in a Exxon stock, or let's say Johnson & Johnson. Then he reads in the newspaper someday that the board of directors of Johnson & Johnson just held a meeting, and they announced, well, they're all lovers of the blue whale, and they're going to invest half the company, to just gut half the company and spend it on efforts to save the blue whale in the South Pacific. You would justifiably be outraged, and you could sue the board of directors in every state. It's called a shareholder derivative lawsuit. By the way, if you ever go to law school, you'll always read a case that's in every book, in the class called business law, about the Wrigley's chewing gum family. This is a true case, the Wrigley's chewing gum family. Some of you might know they owned the Chicago Cubs for many years. They also owned Wrigley Field, which is in downtown Chicago. The old man Wrigley had these quaint sort of nostalgic views about baseball. And he had a rule for Wrigley Field that it was never supposed to have lights on. No lights could be installed at Wrigley Field because he thought baseball was a game that should be played in the daytime, not at night. His shareholders, the lower shareholders, thought, well, my God, that rule is costing me money. It's losing us profits. And he sued the Wrigley family over that. Very famous case in Illinois. It went up and down through the courts of appeals and whatnot. Anyway, you can sue. No corporation can spend unlimitedly. It's a waste of money. They wouldn't do it. And so again, it's just another big lie. You'll see it right in the Missoulian, in the Billings Gazette, the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, that Citizens United allows corporations to spend unlimited amounts on politics. It's not true. If they did, they'd be sued into bankruptcy.
Well, in the interest of transparency, wouldn't it be hard to find out how these corporations spend their money? You'd really have to do some research. Maybe get a lawyer on it, wouldn't you?
Actually, most of the Fortune 100 have rules in place that they must be transparent about where they spend their money. And most of them, you know, the idea that they're funding dark money somewhere that can't be traced, listen, the shareholders can trace anything. They have that right.
I'm not aware of that.
I mean, you know, and by the way, the phrase dark money frequently just means the fact that some of these corporations will spend some money on some 501c for charities, such as the Sierra Club or the NRA or something. I mean, it's really, it is those entities that might put out an ad that might be political in one way or another. It is not the for-profit corporations. It's the non-profit corporations. Sierra Club, NAACP, you know, that put out nonprofit charities will fund ads. There is no danger that the big for-profit corporations are going to spend massively. They would be foolish to do so. I can show you a few examples where, you know, Chevron has spent some money in some areas to try to influence an election, and sometimes they regret it greatly because the voters will have a backlash at them. It happens all the time. It happened with Target. Target, the CEO was spending some money on a governor who was anti-gay marriage in Minnesota. And, you know, there was a big movement to boycott Target. By the way, it's happening again. Now that Target, after promoting, you know, trying to stop gay marriage in Minnesota, they learned their lesson, and then they announced a policy in the last couple of months of having transgender bathrooms. Have you been watching this? And again, they're being punished by the other side. So Target is learning the lesson. These corporations do not want to piss off half their potential customers. So. Go ahead, Mike.
Do you have an opinion on the recently passed dark money bill in last year's legislature?
Yes, I do. I think it's very tragic. In Montana, there was another anti-dark money bill that says that all spending must be known by government. Government has to know every dime. And it's terrifying. Like I said, I read this passage about these people who put out flyers in Nazi Germany and got beheaded. I mean, I didn't mention that a lot of those millionaires who were funding the abolitionist cause in the 1800s to try to overturn slavery, they lived lives of danger. They were attacked on the street. There was one of them who was, actually it's my next slide. This guy right here, William Jay, who was the son of John Jay. William Jay was another big abolitionist and a wealthy funder also of the abolitionist cause, trying to fight slavery. He received so many death threats on a monthly basis. He received a dead baby in the mail. Imagine receiving a dead baby in the mail as a threat over your politics. That other guy, I think Garrett Smith, the millionaire, he received a slave's ear in the mail. These people were constantly in danger. And by the way, they, for that reason, frequently put out they funded secretly. They had to. I mean, it sounds like the worst case scenario, but you know, right in Montana, there is now a rule. All must be naked before the state. Government wants to know, and they call it transparency. To me, that's not transparency. To me, transparency would be your right to know what the evils of government are doing behind your back. Like, for example, funding those NFL moments of silence for the troops things behind your back secretly. That's true dark money, when government is secretly funding, like the CIA buying reporters. That's true dark money. But I think it's scary that the private sector, I mean, ultimately, the point of the First Amendment is that we have the right in our own hands to topple any evil government. We have the right to meet with each other in our basements and try to churn out pamphlets or brochures, just like the White Rose Society did. And I think it's terrible. Again, almost no one agrees with me on this.
I just have a comment. What you said just ties in with Calvin's Declaration of Independence or something. It said, it is our right, it is our duty. When we see government becoming tyrannical, we try to make make some changes or whatever.
It's in the federal papers.
It's what?
That's
In the Federalist? Yeah, it's in the Federalist.
Yeah, the Federalist Papers, yes.
Yeah.
We're charged with that duty in the Second Amendment too. It says form a well-regulated militia, and that's absolutely what you're supposed to do.
See, that ties right in with the First Amendment. The freedom to do what we need to do. I think
The citizen is supposed to be sovereign over government, not government over the citizen.
Yeah, right.
If you Google supremacy clause, it's ass backwards. It says that the federal government has supremacy over the state.
Yeah.
And that is our common view right now because we're being misinformed, both from the very beginning to when we die.
Yeah, and by the way, the original intent was that the supremacy clause was meant to apply only to that very narrow area where there was federal jurisdiction. Every other area was not supposed to fall into that.
So as far as transparency is concerned, like, I'm more concerned with people being able to see how corporations influence and support the government versus corporations being able to keep how they support people as a secret. Because I think, like, it's more important for people to be knowing what's going on versus corporations, like, being anonymous. But what, you don't agree?
I think a lot of this stuff about corporations being, listen, if you abolished the corporate form, by definition, you would give the rich far more power, by definition. Because, like I said, the corporate form is the business model for the little guy. And by the way, it's many, many centuries old. The first known corporations were in ancient India, 800 years BC. The Vikings used the corporate form. And by the way, some people criticize me, even libertarians sometimes criticize me, and they say, well, the corporation is a creature of the state. To which I reply, well, yes, in its modern form, but that is for the benefit of the state, not for the benefit of the corporations. And it doesn't need to be a government-controlled thing. Really, a corporation is just a trust. It's a set of contracts. It's become almost a pejorative term. Many of my friends view the word corporation as an evil thing, and I do not understand that. I don't know if I answered your question.
You brought up some interesting thoughts. Yes.
All right. Anybody else?
Oh, is this presentation on your blog?
I don't think so. I'm not sure we got a good film of it today. I know the cameraman came in late.
Well,
Actually,
just-
I forgot to press record on this.
Just maybe the PowerPoint, I guess is what I meant.
Oh,
I can help you with that.
yeah. I'm going to try to work that. My goal is to go across the state of Montana giving this lecture to anyone who will hear it.
If it gets posted on YouTube, you can always embed it onto your website.
Oh, that's a good idea.
It's a quick, easy fix.
All right. All right. Well, I thank everybody for coming out tonight.
What about our quizzes?
Oh, the quizzes. Oh. Let me think. I'm not sure I answered every question.
Well, give us the answers right now.
Approximately what percentage of government spending on advertising and promotion is persuasive in nature? I think the answer is it is difficult to determine.
Okay.
Because a lot of what government spends on advertising is things like the Smokey the Bear campaign, put out forest fires and things. Not many people disagree with that, you know? But then again, there's the war on drugs stuff that is contested. The Navy is a global force for good. That's contested. By the way, government can manipulate and try to influence in many ways other than just spending. Well, listen, I was going to pass this around. I got this in the mail from Ryan Zinke, congressman. All right. This was paid for by the taxpayers. I had to pay for this. Okay, and he puts this out as this is not campaign literature. This is his literature about what he's doing in Congress. Okay, I had to pay for this. And here he is, his picture of him on the tractor, fighting for Montana ag. Quote, "We very much appreciate Congressman Zinke's efforts to restore the recent severe cuts to crop insurance." That's a quote from Montana grain growers. There's a picture of him with a big smile, fighting for Montana ag. You know, here he is talking to some farmers. You know, this to me could as easily be a campaign brochure, but it's not. This is his official newsletter as congressman to us. And yet, isn't it interesting? He's running for re-election this year. Isn't that fascinating? And he sends this at taxpayer expense. By the way, you look up at the top, and it says, "This mailing was prepared, published, and mailed at taxpayer expense." I want to pass this around.